Oh yeah, part 3, baby. Let's get it. Qin Shi Huang is Lu Buwei's bastard. This refers to a very popular historical rumor that Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, was actually the son of Lu Buwei, a successful merchant and later hugely influential political player in the state of Qin. According to the records of this iceberg's daddy, Sima Qian, I'm becoming a big fan of this guy too. Buwei was a successful merchant from the state of Wei, making a killing off investments in agriculture, jade and pearls and all that good stuff. And one day, while in the state of Zhao, Lu Buwei met Prince Yiren of Qin, who was living in Zhao as a royal hostage, the son of the current heir apparent to the throne of Qin, and grandson to the king of Qin. And despite Yiren being just one of 20 princely siblings, Buwei saw a huge opportunity to increase his own power and prestige in Prince Yiren. As if he were to somehow plant Yiren's cheeks on the throne of the powerful Qin state, Buwei could be elevated to an extremely powerful chancellorship position, and all the untold riches and influence that position comes with as a reward. So, Buwei befriended Yiren and immediately got to making political maneuvers and bribes like an ancient Chinese Littlefinger, and eventually, he convinced the current primary, and childless, wife of Yiren's father, Lord Angguo, to adopt Yiren as their official son, which allowed Yiren to jump all of his 20-odd siblings to be next in line for the Qin throne, Yiren taking the name Zichu, or son of Chu, as his adopted mother was from Chu state, after being adopted. And this is where the theory comes into play, as apparently, according to the Shiji, Lu Buwei had a beautiful dancing girl in his household named Lady Zhao, who Zichu then instantly fell in love with upon first seeing her. He immediately wanted to have her hand in marriage. However, Buwei was not pleased with this development, as Lady Zhao was his favorite huz as well, and he'd have to give up tapping that if he were to marry her off. But ultimately, Buwei chose ambition over cooch and allowed Zichu to marry Lady Zhao, and she soon gave birth to a son, who was named Ying Zheng, or as we come to know him by his imperial title, Qin Shi Huang, or Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of China. Now, some sources claim that Lady Zhao was already pregnant with child when she and Zichu were married, likely fathered by her patron, Lu Buwei, which if true, would make Qin Shi Huang an illegitimate bastard of old Lu Buwei and a former dancing girl. But before we dig into the legitimacy of these rumors, let's round out the rest of Lu Buwei's tale, as it gets pretty intriguing, to say the least. After this marriage, Zichu's grandfather, the king of Qin, died, and his father, Lord Angguo, ascended to the throne of Qin. However, fortunately for Zichu, Lord Angguo died only 3 days after his coronation, and Zichu then ascended to the throne of Qin, being dubbed King Zhuangzi, and almost immediately appointed Lu Buwei as his chancellor, or prime minister, Lu Buwei's investment in Yiren finally paying off in a huge way. But only 3 years later, King Zhuangzi died as well, and his now 13-year-old son, Ying Zheng, ascended to the throne of Qin, Lu Buwei retaining his position as chancellor for the new boy king, making him the most powerful man in Qin. However, Lu Buwei's fall would soon come after some pretty insane court drama erupted in Qin. Allegedly, Lu Buwei and the now Empress Dowager Zhao were still banging on the down low pretty often, and in order to avoid being exposed for his sneaky links with the king's mother, Lu Buwei cooked up an insane scheme to protect himself. According to records, he specifically sought out a man with a large penis, doing meat inspections on several men in Qin, until he found a guy named Lao Ai, who reportedly was swinging an absolute hammer down there. So he made Lao his retainer, and had Lao put his thundercock in a wooden wheel, and hold it up with no hands to show how powerful his member was, and had him walk around and show it off for anyone to see, hoping that Lady Zhao wouldn't be able to resist this beefy wiener wheel upon seeing it. And this ridiculous porn plot actually worked, and Lady Zhao did indeed want that wheeled wiener, and she and Buwei then added another layer to the scheme, to further obfuscate their plot, as Buwei then accused Lao Ai of a crime that would have him castrated as a punishment, but Lady Zhao bribed the castration officer, imagine that being your job, to not relieve Lao Ai of his manhood, and instead just pluck his beard and eyebrows to make him look like a eunuch, and he was then placed as a servant to Lady Zhao, where they then went on to fall in love and they had 2 sons together. Lao Ai even taking control of the Qin government due to his relationship with the Empress Dowager, being known to be extremely arrogant and lavish in his rule. However, everything unraveled when during a drunken rant, Lao Ai yelled out that he was the stepfather of the king, revealing his relationship with the Empress Dowager, which was quickly reported to Ying Zheng, who then discovered that Lao Ai was not a eunuch, and Ying Zheng also discovered that Lao Ai was apparently planning to usurp him and place his own illegitimate children that he had with Lady Zhao on the Qin throne. Laowai attempted to rebel against the king, but the future first emperor defeated him handily, and he decided to brutally purge his court of these treacherous fake eunuchs and schemers, and he executed Laowai and 3 generations of his relatives. He stripped his mother Lady Zhao of her rank as Empress Dowager, and had the son she had with Laowai stuffed into sacks and beaten to death. And he even discovered Lu Buwei's role in the whole crazy scheme as well. He had all his titles stripped, and had him banished to the remote Shu region, which is modern-day Sichuan province, in western China, where Lu Buwei, fearing further retribution from King Ying, eventually went on to commit suicide after poisoning himself. A pretty wild story that makes even Game of Thrones look tame. But let's bring this entry full circle. Was Qin Shi Huang the bastard son of Lu Buwei? Well, it's not impossible if Lady Zhao was indeed retained by Lu Buwei, and if he was banging her constantly. And the rumor that she was already pregnant when she got married to Yiren is one of the most enduring ones in Chinese history. But it's much more likely that this is a form of retroactive slander, written by Han-era historians to delegitimize the at the time much hated Qin Shi Huang and the tyrannical Qin dynasty, by claiming that Qin Shi Huang was not a true-born ruler, but rather the illegitimate bastard of a greedy and scheming merchant, who were considered the lowliest class in Han Confucian-dominated culture, mind you, and a notoriously promiscuous former prostitute dancer, as no records of Qin Shi Huang being a potential bastard appear until after the fall of the Qin dynasty, and Sima Qian himself presents it as a rumor and a possibility, and not as an actual hard fact. And most historians agree that Qin Shi Huang was more likely than not the legitimate son of King Zhuangzi of Qin. But it's still a fascinating story, and one of the more believable ones on this iceberg. Hollow Mountain Theory. I believe this is a collection of beliefs in classical, mythical, and Taoist tradition that holds that mountains are not just large rock and earth formations that are caused by continental plates ramming into each other, but are rather magical places that are not only filled with divine power, but may also be hollow, in a sense, insofar as containing the dwellings of gods and independent realms of the divine within them, like we saw with the Shanhai Jing in Part 1, where it describes several mythical mountains such as Mount Kunlun, Mount Penglai, Mount Flowwave, Bell Mountain, Jade Mountain, and plenty more, along with the weird creatures and gods that live on them, like the Shen, or the mountain gods, bird creatures with human heads, upright oxen with 2 heads and way too many limbs, the fucking Kui, and plenty more. In the Shanhai Jing, it often tells readers to bury their offerings to the Shen, as it's believed that the Shen dwell within the mountains themselves, the mountains being a sort of representation of a gateway between the earth and the realms of the gods. And take Mount Kunlun, or Kunlun Shan, as an example of traditional Chinese mountain worship. Kunlun is sort of the Mount Olympus of the Shanhai Jing, if you will. It's where the supreme god Di makes his earthly home, and the deity known as the Queen Mother of the West is often recorded as living in Mount Kunlun as well. Mount Kunlun is also said to penetrate as deep into the ground as it is tall, an entire mountain-sized underground realm beneath Kunlun, where the quote, weak river, is said to flow out of, a river flowing with mythical water that nothing, not even the lightest of feathers, can float on. The point where the weak river flows out of Kunlun being known as a point where someone can quickly enter the mountain and gain access to the paradise realm within, as you don't just climb to the mountain's summit to obtain immortality and enter the realm of the gods like you'd expect. Rather, you have to first gain access to the mountain itself and enter the cosmic/divine realm within, and then ascend the true mountain from there. You can enter at the base of the mountain via the weak river, or you can also enter Kunlun via its 9 gates, but those are guarded by mythical monsters, like the beast facing east that's detailed in the Shanhai Jing, a mythical, tiger-bodied beast with 9 human heads that will devour any interloping mortals trying to sneak their way into Kunlun without heavenly approval. And this mountain veneration is extended through Taoist cosmology and belief in the 8 pillars, as Taoists believe that mountains like Kunlun act as the axis mundi of the world, which is made up of 8 mythical mountains in each of the 8 cardinal directions that hold up the sky itself, separating the heavens from earth. And if one were to enter and then ascend one of these mountains, they could access the heavens via the mountain's cosmic realm, as the mountains were said to act as ladders between the heavens and earth, and one can even become an immortal spirit upon reaching the top, which is why you'll see Kunlun depicted as a sort of tower or a pillar instead of an actual mountain. However, the perfectly harmonious structure of the 8 pillars was damaged when the water god of destruction Gonggong, ass mad over losing a battle for the throne of heaven with the god of fire Zhurong, did the divine equivalent of fist slamming your desk after getting killed in Counter-Strike, and decided to headbutt the shit out of one of the pillars, Mount Buzhou, in his sore loser rage, ramming headlong into it with his massive ironclad forehead, smashing the shit out of Mount Buzhou and severely damaging the mountain pillar, causing the sky itself to tilt to the northeast and the earth to the southwest, making all rivers now flow in that direction. The goddess Nua tried to repair the broken mountain, but only partially succeeded. She stabilized the heavens and earth, but the new tilts to each remained permanent. And finally, we can see traditional Hollow Mountain worship in the form of Taoist veneration of Dongtian, or grotto heavens. Taoists in the Tang Dynasty believed that immortals lived in, quote, cave heavens, mythical lands underneath mountains that were a sort of plane of existence midway between heaven and earth, where exotic plants and fungi grew and colorful clouds covered unseen skies. And mountains were also believed to be reservoirs of qi, which Taoists could draw upon by living near or on sacred mountains. And as such, in order to tap into these cave heavens and the qi contained within them, Taoists would often meditate and pray in scenic caves, grottos, and other natural rock formations all over China's beautifully mountainous landscapes. And they would often build temples on top of or into the side of mountains. Tang officials eventually identifying 10 greater grotto heavens and 36 lesser grotto heavens all over China for Taoists to visit and experience the great natural beauty of. Basically, TLDR. In traditional Taoist beliefs, mountains were not just massive geological formations, they were physical representations of the spirit power and divine realms of the gods, and contained hidden worlds of immortals and mythical plants and creatures within them. It kind of feels like some Elder Scrolls lore, honestly, which also has 8 quote-unquote towers, stabilizing the world of Mundus, one of which is the massive Throat of the World mountain in Skyrim. So I wonder if Taoist Hollow Mountain theory and belief in the 8 pillars was the inspiration for that. Every Chinese emperor was bisexual. Now this one is true. Every emperor in Chinese history from Qin Shi Huang to Pu Yi loved to dabble in some bussy slaying. Well, maybe not all of them, but many certainly did, and especially during the Han Dynasty. Remember our old pal Wang Mang? Remember how he usurped the Han Dynasty after its late emperor died without a proper heir? Well, that emperor was Ai of Han, probably the most well-known gay emperor in Chinese history, and where the famous story of the Passion of the Cut Sleeve comes from. The story goes that Emperor Ai was napping with his favorite lover, a man named Dongxian, who had fallen asleep on his imperial robe, but when Ai had to get up to attend a court meeting, rather than wake Dongxian, he instead cut the sleeve off his priceless robe to let his favorite fella keep blissfully napping, with the Passion of the Cut Sleeve even becoming a Chinese euphemism for gay sex. So I guess you could use it like, I hear this brothel has a lot of sleeve cutting going on in there if you catch my drift. However, Ai wasn't the only emperor to have known male favorites and lovers. In fact, according to modern historians like Brett Hirsch, and even our favorite grand historian Sima Qian, all of the first 10 Han emperors were openly bisexual. Hell, Qian wrote whole biographies on the male favorites of Han emperors, as on top of being married to women and taking concubines, Ai and Dongxian both had wives of their own, despite their love for each other, as emperors often took male favorites as well, granting them status, prestige, and even sometimes powerful governmental positions, in exchange for certain favors. As ambitious men and eunuchs who weren't afraid to do whatever it takes, goddammit, would gain the attention of and start relationships with the emperor in order to raise their own status and power in the imperial court. Because as emperor of China, you had to do a lot of fucking and baby making. As not only was it extremely important to continue your lineage and produce worthy heirs to rule your empire after you inevitably die in your pursuit of immortality, having lots of sex and children also proved your worthiness and vitality as emperor. And when an emperor failed to fuck powerfully and produce heirs, this could cause huge chaos in the court, and could easily lead to potential usurpations, like we saw with Wang Mang, as Ai had attempted to pass on his throne to Dongxian before he died suddenly at only the age of 24. But the Han court was having none of that shit whatsoever, and they instead forced Dong and his wife to renounce their claims and commit suicide, with Wang Mang coming back to court soon after, at the behest of the current Empress Dowager. And we all know what happens from there. But besides Ai, who seemed to be wholly gay, the other Han emperors who had known male lovers also had wives and concubines as well, whom they fathered children with. Male lovers to them were just some extra action, and a unique form of intimacy, but taking both male and female lovers was a very common and accepted part of Chinese imperial court life, until around the Song dynasty in 960, where the first traces of institutional homophobia in China starts to appear, as the Song dynasty oversaw the expansion of Indian Buddhism in China, which scorned sexuality in general, gay sex even more so. The Song dynasty being the last dynasty to have dedicated chapters to male lovers of powerful rulers in the historical records. And the Mongol-controlled Yuan dynasty also suppressed homosexuality further, as the great Yuan's record-breaking empire had laws in place against sodomy, which is the legal term for taking it up the butt for those unaware. But the rising tide of anti-gay sentiments didn't stop emperors from taking on male lovers, as some Ming dynasty emperors, like the Zhengde Emperor of Ming, reportedly had a Muslim male lover. However, Later Ming codes also outlawed sodomy, which are kept on the books until the fall of the Qing dynasty and even beyond, sodomy not being legalized again until 1997. Now, it's unlikely that every single emperor in Chinese history was bisexual, but it's clear that there's a long-held tradition and acceptance of same-sex relationships among powerful nobles in the imperial court itself. So it's likely that many emperors were indeed bisexual, but we will never know the actual percentage of bi-emperors for sure, as we can only go off of the same-sex relationships that were actually recorded in historical chronicles. And who knows how many gay relationships went unrecorded. An emperor could have blown some twink eunuch's back out during a sneaky link and nobody saw it or wrote it down, and nor do we know for sure what records were fabricated to slander certain emperors following the Song dynasty. It's impossible to know, and these emperors were doing a lot of banging, so only Zhuangzi really knows the answer to this question. But if I had to guess, it was probably stinking to high heaven in many, but not every single one of those imperial chambers. The Lost Chapters of the Zhuangzi. The Zhuangzi, alongside the Tao Te Ching, are considered the two foundational Taoist texts, written sometime in the Warring States period between 476 and 221 BC. Its authorship traditionally credited to legendary Taoist sage Zhuangzi, and where the Tao Te Ching is esoteric, dense, and hard to fully read and understand, the Zhuangzi is far more approachable for the average uncultivated layman like you or me, being a collection of dialogues, fables, parables, and short stories that promote a natural, spontaneous, and carefree life in harmony with nature, and of course, the Tao. And its most famous story is Zhuangzi's butterfly dream, where while napping one day, Zhuangzi dreamed that he was a beautiful butterfly, fluttering around to his heart's content, happy in his simple existence. Yet when he woke up and found that he was Zhuangzi again, he wasn't sure if he was a man who dreamt that he was a butterfly, or was a butterfly dreaming that he was a man. Which was he? Who can even tell for certain? Just some spiritual food for thought. But anyway, the Zhuangzi as we know it today is 33 chapters long and is broken up into 3 sections: the inner chapters, which are chapters 1 through 7, the outer chapters, which are chapters 8 through 22, and the miscellaneous chapters, which are chapters 23 through 33. And this is where we get into this entry, as like the Tao Te Ching, which was traditionally believed to have been solely authored by Lao Tzu, but is now understood to have been iterated on and written by several authors over the centuries. The Zhuangzi has the same authorship issue, as only the first 7 inner chapters are believed to have been written by Zhuangzi himself, and the outer and miscellaneous chapters are believed to have been written by Master Zhuang's disciples and later Taoists over the following centuries. And the full 33-chapter Zhuangzi was first historically compiled during the Qin dynasty by a scholar named Guo Xiang around 300 AD, around 500 plus years after Zhuangzi was recorded to have lived. However, very interestingly, historical chronicles like the Book of Han from 111 AD records that the Zhuangzi actually had 52 chapters, and Sima Qian claims that it was 100,000 characters long. So, what happened? Luckily, we more or less know what happened to these chapters, as Guo Xiang said himself that he had edited and cut down the Zhuangzi when he compiled it, cutting 19 whole chapters out of the original version of the Zhuangzi and trimmed it down to 63,000 characters. So like Han Purple, we got a case of some ancient Chinese lost media here. Guo claims that he had edited down the Zhuangzi in order to preserve the main ideas in it from, quote, later distortions, and he may have edited out chapters and stories that were repetitive, or chapters that may have drifted too far from the core teachings of the original inner chapters, and the 19 trimmed out chapters are now mostly fully lost, complete versions of the cut chapters surviving until around the Tang dynasty, and in current day, we can only speculate on what these chapters may have contained, with our only traces of these lost chapters being found in other ancient texts, like the Huainan Shi, which quotes some of the lost chapters in passing, but based on the surviving evidence, the lost chapters likely followed the same structure as the rest of the text, with metaphorical stories, critical parables, and meditations on Taoist ideas. Also, Guo's edit of the Zhuangzi is actually an edit of an edit, as the Zhuangzi was also redacted and standardized by Han polymath Liu Shang and his apprentice Sun in the late 1st century as well, so there may have been even older chapters that have been lost and modified even earlier in time, and it's pretty fascinating to speculate on what the original, full, uncut, and unabridged version of the Zhuangzi even contained. Someone added to the Lost Media Wiki. Hundun did not kill himself. I believe this refers to Chapter 7 of the Zhuangzi, which tells a very strange story called the Death of Wantan, or the Death of Hundun. Back in the Shanhai Jing entry, you may remember this little fella, Di Jiang, or Hundun, a squat, round, faceless creature that is said to be the representation of the primordial chaos of existence that existed before the heavens and earth separated. Despite being a manifestation of all-encompassing chaos, Hundun was actually a pretty chill and friendly dude. He loved to party, sing, and dance, and he treated his guests very well when they visited him. And in Chapter 7 of the Zhuangzi, the story tells us that the emperors of the northern and southern seas, Shu and Hu, who for some reason are translated as Lickety and Split, or Fast and Furious, Sudden and Sharp, whatever their names were, they had visited Hundun, or Wontons, land in the center, and Hundun treated them well and delighted them with some excellent entertainment. So, Lickety and Split decided to repay Hundun's hospitality, and seeing that he was faceless, they said, "All people have 7 holes for seeing, hearing, eating, and breathing. Wonton alone lacks them. Let's try boring some holes for him." So, to pay back their host, they decided to drill 7 holes into his head to make him seem more like a typical person, hoping to give him eyes to see, nostrils to smell, ears to hear, and a mouth to taste and slurp shit up, so he can experience all the wonderful senses that a human does, boring 1 hole into Hundun each day, until on the 7th day, Hundun died from 7 massive deep wounds to the head. The moral of the story here being that Lickety and Split are in the wrong for trying to artificially force human ideas of order and correctness onto Hundun's chaotic nature, which ends up killing him, as his natural existence is now ruined by these 2 jokers giving him a face of holes, which would then give Hundun a distinct social identity and the ability to experience pain and suffering through these new orifice-endowed senses, as he can now see suffering, smell the stench of death, taste foul foods, and hear evil words and lies, which goes against the formless, chaotic, and jovially indifferent nature of the Tao that he represents. This story warning readers not to go against the natural order of the earth and the universe with our pathetic human social constructs. However, you may wonder, why would Hundun let Beavis and Butthead over here drill 7 holes into his head? Wouldn't that shit hurt? Well, based on some interpretations of the story, if Hundun was indeed a willing participant in the face drilling, as the story makes no indication that he resisted Lickety and Split maiming his body, his death would then be a partial suicide, as he more or less allowed his own death to happen. However, this is unlikely to be the proper interpretation of the story, and Hundun, as a jovial embodiment of primordial chaos, had no real motivation or even a want to kill himself. He isn't a human, and therefore has no ego or desires like we understand them. So, we can cast the blame solely on Shu and Hu, who killed Hundun by forcing him to be more like how they think creatures should be, rather than respecting Hundun's natural existence. So yes, Hundun did not kill himself, but he also didn't do anything to stop his death either. Also, fun fact, Hundun may be where the term wonton originates from, as Hundun sounds a lot like Huntun, a Chinese word for a type of dumpling, and a floating blobby wonton in a soup sort of resembles the rounded and featureless Hundun, who appears to be floating in a sea of primordial chaos, which in this case is the soup's broth, a deliciously chaotic microcosm of the primitive universe. The Hydraulic Empire. This is a theory that first rose to prominence in political theorist and sinologist Karl Wittfogel's book, Oriental Despotism, where he proposes that Eastern nations like India, Egypt, and of course China are quote-unquote hydraulic empires, nations in which governments wield power through the control of the limited amounts of water in said nation, and as such, are far more susceptible to despotic and tyrannical governments who command centralized control of the hydraulics of their empire, as opposed to Europe's more hydraulically bountiful geography and feudal government structures. As you probably already know, rivers and water are extremely important to Chinese history and culture. The first humans in China settled near the Yellow and Yangtze River valleys, making them the cradles of Chinese civilization. And remember the legends of Yu the Great? He became a legendary and foundational king of ancient China and started the first mythical Xia dynasty after he had tamed the Great Flood, by using his exceptional engineering powers to build a robust network of irrigation canals to control the floods and dredge the shit out of the rivers, an analog to the frequent flooding of China's rivers. And archaeological excavations of ancient prehistoric Chinese cultures, like the Liangshu, have revealed that water engineering and irrigation control have been utilized in China since even before 5000 BC. The first Chinese governments and cities cropping up thanks to this centralized water control infrastructure. In the feudal warring states period, regional lords had total control over their own segments of China's rivers and would often intentionally cause floods or sabotage irrigation infrastructure in other states as a warfare tactic. And when Qin Shi Huang united China under his Qin dynasty, control of the river's irrigation systems fell into the hands of the empire, who could now project their own power by organizing massive nationwide irrigation projects to try and tame the rivers as best they could, and to supply China's massive rice farming efforts, as rice is a notoriously thirsty crop. And this centralized imperial government system would last for over 2,000 years. However, despite control of hydraulics being the bedrock of Chinese society and government, it doesn't explain the whole picture of Chinese history and shifts in governmental power, as it wouldn't be accurate to say Imperial China was exceptionally despotic. I mean, sure, some dynasties like the Qin were far more tyrannical and brutal than other dynasties. See the 9 familial exterminations and mass book burnings and scholar burying for more. But Qin Shi Huang didn't win China because he could build a better dam than any other Eastern joke king. He won China through his brutally efficient government and massive armies. And also, if the rivers flooded and caused mass destruction of crops and infrastructure, in the event that the government failed to respond to these disasters, the peasantry would often rise up in rebellion against the emperor, as it was believed that a flood or loss of control of the rivers was a divine sign that the emperor had lost the mandate of heaven. It must be replaced with a new, more worthy ruler, which was almost always done through extremely chaotic and bloody revolts and civil wars. In a religiously backed tradition, a peasant revolt when the emperor fails to prevent natural catastrophes punches a pretty big hole in the hydraulic despotism argument. I mean, it can certainly help explain the origins of Chinese civilization, but it doesn't account for the societal nuances and later developments of Imperial China that were mostly driven by shifts in military power, not control of water resources and infrastructure. Noah and Yu the Great are the same person. I think each and every one of us Westoids knows who Noah is. The biblical patriarch who had built his massive ark after God told him that he's rage-wiping his save file and restarting the planet with a massive flood that killed everyone and everything on Earth that wasn't on Noah's ark when the downpour started. Noah's family and the animals on board the ark repopulating the Earth after the flood stopped. Whereas Yu the Great is credited with building China's first irrigation and river drainage control infrastructure to combat a massive flood that was sweeping over China for years. Now, it may seem like Yu the Great and Noah share the same role across both cultures and could potentially be the same person, at least in a mythological sense. Both are legendary builders and patriarchs of nations who had to deal with a massive flood. But beyond the surface level comparisons, there are several important differences between Noah's flood myth and Yu's flood myth. In Noah's flood, Noah is chosen by God to ensure that his creation survived the flood, and Noah is completely at God's mercy and direction. Whereas in Yu's story, the flood is a continuous natural catastrophe that humans have to survive through and adapt to. The flood's driving humans to live high in the mountains of ancient China, or even up in the trees like monkeys. And the flood is localized to China, and it doesn't cover the entire Earth. And instead of being at the mercy of God, Yu and his allies fight back against the flood to try and work to tame it. Yu the Great building massive irrigation infrastructure to control it through robust drainage systems, and lots of dredging. And Yu's relationship with the divine and mythical creatures is also very different from Noah's, as instead of being given a clear order to build an ark and survive the coming deluge, rather, in some versions of Yu's story, Yu gets magical help in the form of mythical beasts, such as a channel-digging dragon and a giant mud-hauling tortoise appearing to help him build his irrigation systems, or the god of the Yellow River appearing to give Yu a map of the river to help him plan out his irrigation work. He still gets mythical help, but he still has to complete the project with his own 2 hands and his own intelligence. And finally, Yu the Great and Noah's stories have fundamentally different lessons and themes to them. With Noah's story, it teaches believers to trust in and fear God's power, and to submit to his will and follow his orders in order to survive and thrive on Earth. Whereas Yu the Great's tale highlights the power of human ingenuity, dedication to one's work no matter how daunting the task, and the need to collaborate with others to build infrastructure that benefits the whole nation and conquers the very forces of nature. Also, unlike his son Shem, who some Christians believed went far to the east after the flood, like we saw with the figurists, Noah is never recorded as having traveled beyond the modern-day Middle East, as his ark was purportedly set down on Mount Ararat, which is believed to be in modern-day Armenia/Western Anatolia, Noah living to the extremely ripe old age of 950 before dying. So, despite the initial similarities, Noah and Yu are definitely much different people, unless there's some sort of apocryphal biblical text I don't know about that tells the story of Noah traveling to China after the flood and changing his name to Yu and doing some massive hydraulic civil engineering projects for fun. Like, maybe China's flood was a leftover from the Great Flood, so Noah had to come and slay this final straggler flood to fulfill his covenant to God or something. The Shangshu is a legalist text. The Shangshu, or the Book of Documents, is one of the 5 Confucian classics and is a collection of recorded speeches and orations given by ancient rulers from the ancient Xia to the eastern Zhou dynasties of China, and is revered by Confucians as a collection of examples of righteous rulers and their virtuous actions that current rulers should follow the example of. The Shangshu also has a pretty fascinating publication history unto itself, traditionally believed to have been first compiled by none other than Master Kong himself, with some of its earliest chapters believed to have been written around the 6th century BC or earlier, making it partially one of the oldest surviving literary works in Chinese history. However, things start to get fragmented and murky with the Shangshu during the Qin dynasty's burning of books and burying of scholars that reportedly occurred between 213 and 212 BC, where in an attempt to destroy any non-Qin approved histories and philosophies, Qin Shi Huang, at the behest of his advisor Li Su, had ordered all classic historical and philosophical books of the 100 schools of thought burned, under threat of brutal punishment to those who kept private copies, to try and solidify Qin legalist ideals and erase the ideas of the past. The Shangshu was a target of these burnings, as it recounted ancient dynastic histories that the Qin would not approve of, and many copies were burned and chapters were destroyed. Traditional accounts claim that the Shangshu originally had 100 chapters, but only 29 chapters written in the modern Qin standardized script managed to survive after the book burnings took place. However, very interestingly, reportedly, one of Confucius's descendants, a man named Kang Guo, claimed to have found 16 to 25 chapters of the Shangshu hidden in the walls of Confucius's ancestral estate in Khufu. These hidden chapters were written in Old Chinese, or the archaic script, the script most commonly used before Qin writing standardizations, making them seem to be more likely to be authentic. And in 317 AD, a scholar named Mei Zhe presented what he claimed to be the complete 58-chapter version of the Shangshu to the Jin dynasty court. Mei's version including Kang Guo's old script hidden in the wall chapters, which were accepted as authentic by imperial scholars at the time, despite some skepticism over the extreme convenience of this amazing lost chapter discovery. But despite that, this version of the Shangshu remained as accepted Confucian orthodoxy, all the way until the 17th century, when Qing Dynasty scholar Yan Kuo-shi had proved that the old script chapters were later forgeries created in the 3rd or 4th century AD, created to lend more legitimacy to Confucian ideals in ancient Chinese history and government. And modern scholars also agree that the hidden-in-the-wall chapters were very likely 3rd or 4th century forgeries. And they also believe that the core 29 chapters aren't exact records of actual speeches and edicts that these ancient rulers gave either, and are rather likely early Zhou-era revisions, which makes sense. The Shangshu records the actions and words of legendary figures like Yu the Great, Emperor Tang the Perfect of Shang, and Emperor Yao, one of the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors who predated Yu the Great, who was said to have ruled when the mythical ancient Great Flood first swept over China. Hell, the Xia dynasty, if you remember, has never been archaeologically proven to have ever even existed, so any documents claiming to be from that era should be taken with a healthy dose of skepticism. But, is the Shangshu actually a secret legalist text? Well, considering that it was a target of Qin book burnings, is one of the 5 core Confucian classics, and is understood to be half-fabricated with explicitly pro-Confucian orations written centuries after the original chapters were believed to have been written, I'd say it's not a legalist text. But it certainly influenced later legalist thought and administration practices, as chapters like Luan Punishments and Proclamation of King Kang outline systems of laws and punishments and emphasize strict punitive rule and to not tolerate any disobedience, along with emphasizing the necessity of power to be centralized around one singular sovereign ruler. These aspects of the Shangshu undoubtedly inspiring later legalist philosophers like old Han Fei, as he developed his own version of legalism that emphasized centralized control of people through strict laws and brutal punishments, reflecting the immense influence the Shangshu has on almost all ancient Chinese philosophies. Song Ping is Lu Dongbin. To understand this theory, let's start with Lu Dongbin. Lu Dongbin is a Taoist sage and scholar who is reported to have lived during the Tang dynasty of 618 to 907 AD, and is considered one of the 8 legendary Taoist immortals, even being considered the leader of the immortal squad. When Dongbin was born, it's said that an amazing fragrance filled his room. He came out of the womb smelling sensational. And Dongbin trained as a bureaucrat and attempted and failed the notoriously hard-as-dick Imperial Civil Service exam twice, attempting to get a sweet government job to elevate his family's status. But before he attempted the exam a 3rd time, he dozed off and had an extremely distressing and realistic dream. He dreamt that he had took and aced the civil service exam, and his life from then on was cash fucking money. He crushed the exam so hard that he was appointed vice minister, working his way up to becoming the prime minister, second only to the emperor himself. He married a beautiful and wealthy woman, had a son and a daughter, and was rich and influential beyond his wildest imagination. But the other bureaucrats grew jealous of Lu Dongbin's overwhelming motion and success, and they conspired together to slander him as a traitor, where he then lost his rank, his wife betrayed and left him, his children were killed by bandits, and Lu himself died broken alone on the street, waking up from his dream shortly after dying as a homeless bum. And Dongbin had lived 18 whole years in his dream, yet he only had slept for a few hours, if that, in the real world. And upon waking, he decided to not take the civil service exam, and instead joined a Taoist immortal named Zhuangzi Qian to live in the wilderness and cultivate himself as a Taoist sage, eventually succeeding in becoming an immortal himself through internal alchemy, where one perfectly balances and cultivates their Jing, or their essence, their Qi, or their breath, and their Shen, or their spirit, to obtain unity with a primordial Tao, which makes you immortal, somehow. And now, as a fresh young immortal, Dongbin then has plenty of interesting encounters and adventures, like the story of a prostitute named White Peony tricking Lu Dongbin into nutting at her by tickling his dick and balls during sex, as Lu would constantly bang her, but he never finished his business with her. He didn't want to skeet out his precious yang energy, you see. And he also killed a bunch of dragons with his magical sword, which is pretty beast. And since Lu Dongbin is believed to be immortal, it's possible that he could still be out there, living among us, perhaps in the form of Song Ping, the oldest living member of the Chinese Communist Party. As of today, Song Ping is 108 years old, allegedly born in 1917, where he would have lived through the warlord era, 2 Chinese civil wars, World War II, and the rise of Mao Zedong and all the shenanigans that came after that, which must have been a hell of a life. The dude must have an amazing story. And Song Ping here is also a pretty well-respected party figure, being the mentor of future Chinese Communist Party General Secretary Hu Jintao, and he attended the 20th National Party Conference at the spry age of 105, making him a sort of Chinese internet phenomenon for a little bit due to his impressive oldness. Now is it possible that Lu Dongbin is Song Ping, spending his immortal life working as a mid to high-level communist official? Song Ping is exceptionally old after all, and is known for his wise mentor status in the party. But, well, as funny and as insane as it would be, I don't think Song Ping is the legendary Taoist immortal Lu Dongbin from the Tang Dynasty. I mean, Song Ping, based on all the photographic and historical evidence, is clearly aging naturally like any given human, and I don't think a proper immortal would be affected by the ceaseless march of time. By definition, immortals don't exactly age, so it's highly unlikely that they're the same guy. Also, Lu Dongbin chose not to ascend to heaven after obtaining immortality, as he wants to enlighten the whole world about the Tao and create as many new immortals as he could. And last I checked, the CCP isn't exactly spreading the words and lessons of Taoism, so I think he'd be wasting his time working as a Chinese Communist Party official, if that was his true goal the whole time. And we also have records of Song Ping's birth, which allegedly occurred on April 24th, 1917, which, if confirmed, nukes his theory from orbit. And coming off a life of wine drinking, demon and dragon slaying, and hanging out with his 7 immortal pals, Lu Dongbin would probably be pretty bored with his life as old Song Ping. Also, where's the magic sword? Lu Dongbin is known for being a sort of Taoist warrior poet, and Song Ping has never been photographed with a sword, nor do we know of any poems that he's published. So if he's Lu Dongbin, he certainly doesn't act like him either. Xunzi was 150 years old. Xunzi was an influential Confucian scholar who lived during the Warring States period. Born Xun Kuang in the state of Zhao around 310 BC, Xunzi is considered the third great philosopher of Confucianism, behind only Mencius and old Big C himself. And unlike Mencius, who believed that human nature was inherently good, Xunzi believed humans were naturally bad, but believed that this evil nature could be overcome through dedication to Confucian ideals of education, ritual, and proper laws and governance. And he was also a religious skeptic for his time, teaching that people should be more concerned with understanding human society as a foundation on how to properly rule, rather than trying to understand the mysterious machinations and wills of heaven to inform proper governance. You can think of Mencius as a Confucian idealist, while Xunzi was more of a Confucian realist. And Xunzi's ideas of inherently evil human nature and proper laws and punishments heavily influencing his students, which reportedly included the legalist philosopher Han Fei and Qin Dynasty Chancellor Li Su, 2 instrumental figures in bringing about China's first united emperor under the Qin. Han Fei being the political mastermind behind Qin legalism, and Li Su being the Qin's head chancellor for almost half a century, spearheading much of their standardization efforts, and was a staunch proponent in building a truly meritocratic government. However, much like other historical records of famous figures from the Eastern Zhou period, solid records on the actual details of Shunxi's life are incomplete, fragmentary, and speculative, and it's unknown when his true birth date even is, and much of his movements across China's warring states and the roles he took on there are unknown, as most of the info on his life comes from his eponymous text, the Sun Shi, which, as a disclaimer, was first fully compiled in the 1st century BC, which would be a few hundred years after Shunxi's purported death. And of course, info on Shunxi can be found in the records of the Grand Historian, or the Shiji, written by our good friend, Suma Alfac No Cap Chien. And well, most records place Shunxi being born around 310 BC, and dying sometime after 238 BC, based on the fact that he was still alive when his current patron, Lord Chunshen of Chu, was assassinated in 238 BC, which would make him around 75 to 90 years old at the time of his death based on accounts, a solid age to live to for sure. However, this theory comes into play when Shunxi travels to the state of Qi from Zhao. Most historians agree that he was 15 Sui, which would make him 13 to 14 years old, when he first went to Qi for the first time. However, it's possible that this age could be construed as 50 Sui, which would make Sun Shi 48 to 49 years old when he first came to Qi, which would place his birth date at around 350 BC. And if he went on to die sometime after 238 BC, that would make him well over 130 years old at his time of death, with a possibility that he died at the ripe old age of 150 if we take his latest possible death date into account. Now, considering that no records of Sun Shi describe him as being exceptionally old or long-lived, as Sima Qian places his lifespan at around 70 to 90 years old, and the only evidence we have for him living over 100 comes from a potential mistranslation or misunderstanding of his age when he first traveled to Qi State. So, it's highly unlikely they lived to be 130 to 150 years old, which lets Jean Clément of France hold on to her title as the oldest raisin in human history, confirmed to have died at the age of 122. TLV Mirror-Portals. This refers to TLV mirrors, handheld bronze mirrors that were created during the Han Dynasty, being called TLV mirrors because some of the symbols on the back of it look like T's, L's, and V's. Before reflective glass was invented, polished bronze was reflective enough that it could be used as a mirror, although the reflected image wasn't as good as our current modern glass mirrors. TLV mirrors being an example of one of these handheld ancient bronze mirrors, and they were designed and carved to represent the Han's understanding of the world and the cosmology of the heavens, with the mirrors depicting a square within a circle, which represents the earth and the heavens, the Han believing the earth to be squared and the heavens to be rounded, with representations of the north, east, south and west seas, and with 8, quote, nipples outside of the square representing the 8 pillars holding up heaven from earth, and 9 nipples within the square representing the 9 regions on earth, all as outlined in the Shanhai Jing's mythical geography, complete with mythical creatures like dragons adorning its rim, and the cardinal direction animals like the phoenix, tiger, and black tortoise. This design of a chart of the heavens and earth likely being used to symbolically place the mirror's user in the center of the universe when held, a sort of handheld portal to heaven, if you will. It also likely represents a board game for Liu Bo, an ancient Chinese board game that the rules for have been unfortunately lost to time. So add the Liu Bo rulebook to the Lost Media Wiki too. And the game is usually associated with Taoist immortals, who apparently had a fondness for playing some Liu Bo to pass their infinite time. And this also could refer to the practice of burying bronze mirrors in Han and Tang era graves, as the ancient and medieval Chinese believed that these bronze mirrors could hold and release light, which would illuminate and protect tombs from evil, along with potentially acting as guiding portals for the deceased so they can cross over to the afterlife. And not only that, but Taoists have been using mirrors as a tool for exorcisms for millennia, as they believe that unseen spirits would be scared away when they saw their own reflections, kind of like how the evil Zhuangzi were repelled when you held a mirror up to them. And finally, we see this reverence for mirrors in feng shui practices, where mirrors are very important to the energy flow of a home. Small baoge mirrors are usually placed near the front of a home to reflect and ward off evil spirits, and placing mirrors in places like opposite your bed or reflecting where you work is a big no-no, as mirrors amplify the energy of what it reflects in feng shui belief, and nobody really wants to watch themselves work or sleep. And when your sleeping body is reflected, how can you know for certain that your reflected self is also sleeping? Ban wrote the Kaogongji. The Kaogongji, or the Book of Diverse Crafts / the Artificer's Record, is an ancient Chinese engineering manual and is the oldest known technical encyclopedia in human history. It contains recipes for advanced bronze metal making through the use of pre-prepared alloys, chariot and weapon crafting, architecture and carpentry, fabric weaving and dyeing, and its most well-known aspect, its focus on city planning and the ideal layout of a capital city, which was laid out in a square, mirroring the Chinese cosmological idea of the Earth being square in shape, aligned to the 4 cardinal directions, and it also contained 12 gates, intersecting streets, markets, temples, and a central palace all laid out in a strict order, as to make the city a sort of microcosm of the Earth itself. The Kaogongji is believed to have been compiled somewhere in the range of 500 to 300 BC. Now, like many of the other Chinese classic texts created during the Eastern Zhou period, its authorship is unknown, and was likely compiled from several different authors' works, likely from anonymous government planners and functionaries, who oversaw artisan workers and their projects, and the Kaogongji is included as part of the Zhou Li, or the Rites of Zhou, which is traditionally believed to have been credited to the Duke of Zhou, who reigned during the 11th century BC, although many scholars doubt it's that old, as its writing style and terminology seems contemporary with later Zhou periods, and 500 to 300 BC was a time when many of these early technical and bureaucratic manuals and works were being most commonly compiled. However, is it possible that Lu Ban, the legendary historical engineer and folk god of builders, may have wrote the Kaogongji himself? The timelines could line up. Lu Ban is believed to have lived from around 507 to 444 BC, right around a century or so before the time the Kaogongji is believed to have been first fully compiled, and Lu Ban would be the perfect person to write a technical engineering manual on paper, as he's credited with the invention of the kite in the form of his flying wooden bird contraption like in part 1, along with the saw, grappling hooks, siege ladders, the umbrella, and plenty of other essential ancient Chinese tools. But unfortunately for any Lu Ban heads out there, there's almost a 0% chance that he's the true author of the Kaogongji, as Lu Ban is a far more legendary figure than real man, as folk belief in Lu Ban being the father of a myriad of Chinese inventions was a belief that grew over time, later carpenters and engineers building his legend over the centuries by attributing more and more inventions to him. Also, Lu Ban has no other texts or manuals whose authorship is historically attributed to him, and the writing style of the Kaogongji is that of an administrative manual by and for government officials on how to best perform standardized public works and artisan projects. And Lu Ban was not known to hold any administrative government roles, and most of his legendary work is focused on inventing new tools and mechanisms, not performing standardized artisanal projects and overseeing city planning. And not to mention the overwhelming scholarly consensus that the Kaogongji likely had multiple authors in the form of anonymous government administrators, and it was likely not written by a semi-legendary ancient Chinese engineering prodigy who could build flying wooden bird contraptions. Taotie Cryptids. This refers to the Taotie, an ancient Chinese mythical beast that's considered one of the 4 perils described in the Shanhai Jing, being the embodiment of gluttony. Taotie literally translating to greedy glutton, a monster that would never be satisfied no matter how much it ate, as ancient depictions of it only had a face to eat, yet no body to digest. But in the modern day, it's usually depicted as a large-mouthed reptile-like beast, or a horned goat-like beast, as its myth was expanded upon in later works, like the Shanhai Jing. However, this mythical creature stands out amongst the huge amount of weird-ass legendary Chinese beasts, as the Taotie was frequently used as a motif on ancient Chinese dings. The Taotie's large bulging eyes, curled horns, and the top of its mouth and fangs clearly visible on several of these ancient bronze cauldrons. But what is a ding, you may ask? Well, they're pretty fascinating artifacts unto themselves. A ding is a bronze cauldron that stands on either 3 or 4 legs, and is usually emblazoned with Taotie monster faces, dragons, and even written records in some cases. Dings were most popular in the ancient days of the Shang and Zhou dynasty eras of China. The earliest dings believed to have been created around 1900 BC, before even the Shang dynasty rose to power, making them predate Chinese writing as far as we know. And they were used as vessels for religious rituals, cooking pots, and for storage, as food would be placed into the dings as a symbolic way of offering sustenance to the spirits and gods. And not only did they have a religious ritualistic use, they were also symbols of power and prestige. If you owned an authentic ding in ancient China, that likely meant you were a sort of ruler, or at least a nobleman or a scholar of some kind. This tradition of ding collecting coming from the legendary Xia dynasty itself, as legends hold that after the Great Flood had been tamed and Yu the Great established his new kingdom, either Yu or his son had collected bronze from all 9 of his newly established provinces and cast the metal into 9 massive tripod dings, which allegedly weighed 7.5 tons each. Some beefy bronze bowls for sure. However, sometime before the end of the Warring States period, the Qin had discovered Yu's legendary vessels at the eastern Zhou capital and had decided to move them to the Qin capital of Xianyang. However, the vessels were somehow lost in transit, and by the time Qin Shi Huang united China into its first imperial dynasty, the vessels had been long lost and were never found again. Maybe they fell into a river or something. But regardless, based on this legend, Zhou kings would often own 9 dings, just like in the old legends, to symbolize their heaven-mandated right to rule, many of these vessels having Taotie faces emblazoned on them, which has led many scholars to wonder, why put this odd monster face on so many ritual vessels? And that's a question historians and archaeologists still ponder to this day. Was it a ward against evil spirits? A mediator between the living and spiritual worlds, where the Taotie symbolizes how the spirits would quote-unquote consume the offerings through the gluttonous beast's face? A visual warning against gluttony and excess, perhaps? Dings were used as cooking pots after all, so the Taotie faces may be there to remind you not to completely pig out and devour excess food like the monster with no body. Or maybe some secret other thing nobody even knows about? Maybe even, perhaps, an ancient, now extinct Chinese animal or cryptid? Well, since the Taotie mask was quite abstract, and its myth has evolved over time from just a face with no body cast into the side of a bronze cauldron to a full-body creature, it's unlikely that it was ever a real animal. There's no fossil record of a Taotie-like creature ever existing, and we know for a fact that it was at least related to the ancient Chinese religion that the Shang and early Zhou practiced, which was eventually replaced with the more modern Confucian philosophies and the belief in the abstract higher power of heaven as societal religious institutions in China. And dings fell out of favor as religious objects as the centuries rolled on, and dynasties rose and fell, going from extremely important symbols of power and vessels for religious ritual to curious and artistically interesting artifacts of dynasties past. And as for the Taotie, it's still a fairly popular monster in Chinese culture. They were in that Chinese Matt Damon movie, The Great Wall, but in that movie they're legit aliens with a hive mind, and a Queen Taotie calling all the shots. And I don't think that's how the ancient Chinese originally envisioned this monster. Han Fei and Li Su were lovers. Along with old Emperor Qin Shi Huang himself, Han Fei and Li Su could be considered the big 3 of ancient Chinese Qin legalism, Han Fei being one of the masterminds behind legalist philosophy, writing the Han Fei Su, the philosophical book that was the backbone of Qin legalist society, where Li Su was the most powerful legalist operator behind only old Qin Shi Huang himself, serving as Chancellor of Qin from 246 to 208 BC, and was Qin Shi Huang's top guy for pretty much his entire reign, helping oversee the Qin standardizations of writing systems, weights and measurements, laws and ordinances, and building a meritocratic government apparatus, and he was reportedly the main driving force behind the burning of books and burying of scholars in order to suppress academic dissent and solidify Qin cultural dominance and control over historical narratives. However, according to friend of the channel, Sima Qian, Han Fei and Li Su had a long, intertwined, and even tragic relationship with each other. According to Qian, Li Su and Han Fei were both students of Xunzi, the Confucian philosopher from earlier in the video who taught that all humans were inherently bad and virtueless and must overcome their quote-unquote evil nature through rigorous Confucian ritual, education, service, and proper laws and punishments. These ideas heavily influencing the two, who would expand on these ideas of control and conquering the innate badness of humanity through laws, punishments, and proper service, but taking it in a far more authoritarian direction with their Qin legalism. While studying under Shangshu, Qian says that Li Su and Han Fei were friends, but Han Fei had a stutter, making it impossible for him to properly present his ideas at court. However, Han Fei made up for this stutter with his elite intelligence and immense writing skill, writing several influential papers that amounted to over 100,000 characters, criticizing the rampant nepotism and endless wars and chaos of the era. And Li Su was extremely impressed with Han Fei's writing, reportedly even admitting that he was nowhere near as competent of a writer and legal thinker as Han Fei. However, they parted ways after completing their studies, Han Fei returning to his home of Han State, naturally, whereas Li Su eventually ended up in the powerful state of Qin, searching for government positions to advance his career, where he eventually met and impressed the Qin king, Ying Zhang, with his sharp rhetoric and detailed plans on how to fully unify China under a single state's rule. And one of the steps in this unification plan being a Qin invasion and annexation of the neighboring state of Han, in order to flex their military power and to intimidate the other states. But as we know, the state of Han was Han Fei's home, and Fei was even a member of the ruling Han aristocracy, a pretty rare high birth status amongst the Warring States philosophers. So, in hopes of stopping the annexation, Han Fei was sent to parley with Qin Shi Huang, hopefully to resolve this crisis diplomatically. And this is when Li Su sprung his trap, as when Han Fei arrived, Li Su, who had grown bitterly jealous of Han Fei's intellect, influence, and penmanship, successfully convinced King Ying that Han Fei could not be allowed to leave, as he'd be a serious threat to Qin, nor can he be recruited to serve Qin either, as his connections to Han nobility and his written arguments on why Han state should be preserved made him completely untrustworthy. In trusting the words of his most trusted advisor, Qin Shi Huang had Han Fei imprisoned, where in an attempt to win over the future first emperor, Han Fei wrote a paper called In the First Time of Meeting Qin King. But before Ying Zheng could read it, tragically, Li Su had forced Han Fei to Epstein himself in prison by consuming poison, Han Fei dying in captivity, betrayed by his old friend and peer, Li Su. Brutal. Ying Zheng eventually read and loved the paper, but Han Fei was already past tense by then, a death King Ying truly regretted, who would then go on to conquer Han state 3 years later, and he used Han Fei's writings and philosophies to craft his new totalitarian Qin dynasty. Now, if we were to read between the lines here a bit, one could potentially see a tragic, doomed yaoi story between these two men, a sort of lovers to enemies arc, where they started out as student peers that had a strong mutual respect for each other, and maybe that mutual respect extended to some other aspects, to them eventually becoming ruthless political rivals, where Li Su had no qualms in manipulating his lord to kill Han Fei off, fearing his political influence and deeply jealous of his philosophical and writing aptitude. However, besides this line of speculation and general vibes, we have no evidence that Han Fei and Li Su were cutting sleeves with each other. All the info about their personal relationship comes from Sima Qian, who of course never embellishes or dramatizes the lives and actions of the historical figures he records. And in the Shiji, Qian makes no claims or presents any rumors that the two were doing some legalist BDSM or anything like that. So the idea that Li Su and Han Fei were lovers was very likely a later literary invention or rumor derived from the tragic nature of their interpersonal relationship, as the claim has no actual basis in any Chinese historical records. Well, with that, that's all I got for you today. If you like this one, we'll do part 4, but maybe after a break from a video or two. But we're going to see this thing through to the end. And if you're still watching, I love you all very much. And I'm sorry this took a while. I got a cold and I was stuffed up for days, so that prevented me from recording. But we're back. Anyway, I love you all. Goodbye.